Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to our group presentation. My name is Willson. The others in my group consist of Kade Madden, Thomas Ledbetter, and Braden Ison. The topic we'll be presenting you today is the push to integrate monetary exchanges in the globalized world. When coming up with our topic, we contemplated many different areas of globalized economies and the effects they could have towards overall globalization with exchange rates. When contemplating this, we were faced with two primary questions. The first of them being, how should monetary policy respond to nominal exchange rates? That was our first question we decided we'd like to answer, with the second one being, how does this change as economies become increasingly globalized? In this paper, we primarily focus these questions towards Asia, focusing on structural changes that may influence the optimal policy response to exchange rates. So, how should central banks respond to exchange rates? Across the Asia-Pacific region, we see a wide variety of different responses that vary. For example, in Australia and New Zealand, the exchange rate is allowed to float relatively freely, and the central banks hold very low levels of foreign exchange reserves. At a totally other extreme, we see Hong Kong SAR enjoys a de facto fixed exchange rate due to its currency board mechanism, and domestic monetary policy is effectively subordinated to maintaining a stable external value of the currency relative towards the US dollar. But for the most of other economies in the region, monetary authorities appear to lean against changes towards the exchange rate using foreign exchange intervention. Excuse me. Further, as we will see, this intervention appears to have been effectively sterilized. Significant growth in foreign currency assets on the balance sheets of central banks has not coincided with any corresponding change in domestic currency within circulation, or a loss of domestic inflation control. Throughout this presentation, we'll see examples of data, charts that coincide with our research to further show y'all the research we've done towards this topic and let y'all see. Next that we'll be presenting is Braden Ison. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, William. My name is Braden Ison, and I'm going to look at how central banks in Asia have responded to exchange rates. In many Asian economies, a common response to exchange rate fluctuation has been foreign exchange intervention, and this is intended to smooth the path of exchange rates. Perhaps the most important policy tool used to stabilize exchange rates in Asia has been direct intervention in foreign exchange markets. One consequence of this is the massive expansion of foreign exchange reserves on central balance sheets in the region. The overall size of the central balance sheet has increased drastically over the past decade due to this. Changes in the foreign exchange reserves account for nearly all the change in the size of the overall central bank balance sheet. Here we have the composition of central bank assets in emerging Asia from 2002 to 2012, and with almost 100% of GDP in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore, and more than 30% of GDP in China, Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. So with that being said, the accumulation of the foreign exchange reserves must be financed in some way, and according to these statistics, it can be concluded that the exchange rates have caused a massive increase on the balance sheets, which coincides with all of them being financed. And we can determine how all that took place if we look at the other side of the balance sheet. So here we have the composition of central bank liabilities in emerging Asia from 2002 to 2012. And we see the corresponding changes in the liabilities that coincide with the asset growth from the previous slide. With this, we only see a small portion of the increase in foreign exchange reserves have been financed, but it has an increase with the amount of currency in circulation. So reserves and the assurance of sterilization instruments have been used effectively to sterilize the effects of the increase in foreign exchange reserves and this allows policymakers to maintain domestic monetary control. So despite the large increase in the size of the balance sheets, there really appears to have been no loss of domestic monetary policy control, which shows that they need to evolve into a new way of doing things. So going forward, one possibility would be for policymakers to continue with the past practices and continue to lean against ongoing exchange rates pressures and with foreign exchange intervention. But there are reasons to believe that this may be becoming a less attractive option. And because the large holdings of foreign exchange reserves are very costly to the central banks in the region, and they're only likely to become more costly as everything grows larger. So here we have an estimates of sterilization costs and valuation losses from domestic currency appreciation. And so this is just an illustration of the possible cost of large reserves under the simplifying assumption that all reserves are held in short-term U.S. Treasury bills and that are financed with the sale of short-term sterilization bills with an interest cost equal to domestic deposit rate. And that's important because typically the domestic interest rates in Asia are higher than yields to the central bank earn on reserves. And the difference between these two is a loss to the central bank, which may be as much as 1.2% GDP per year for some economies, which 1.2% might not seem like a huge jump, but 1.2% per year, is only going to grow to a bigger number as things become mismanaged and the economies become larger. And another reason to reconsider the policy of intervention in exchange markets. Another reason to reconsider the policy of intervention in the exchange markets is that the region is undergoing structural change. We all know that Asia is a developing country and that, some parts of Asia are very, very developed and some aren't. But as time goes on, those ones that aren't are becoming more developed. So as a result of structural change, policy measures that were effective in the past may become less so in the future. This goes with anything. Something that was effective 50 years ago probably isn't going to be effective 50 years later due to the growth and the scale of everything. So with that being said, we're going to move on to the evolution of emerging Asian economies. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your presentation.
Okay, so my name is Kade Ledbetter. Now, since we've already talked about how have central banks in Asia responded to these exchange rates, we're going to get into the evolution of emerging Asian economies. So when I say emerging Asian economies, this means emerging nations, which it derives its meaning from such terms as emerging markets, economies, powers, and even states. There's been a wide range of changes in the structure of Asian economies. High economic growth over decades. The high economic growth over decades has put some of the emerging countries, most prominently BRIC, which consists of Brazil, India, and China, on par with the G7 advanced economies. There's been global share of emerging economies, which has expanded. The global share went from around 20% in 2000 to upwards to 40% in 2010. So some possible explanations for the declining exchange rate through the Asian economies. There's been changes in inflation, composition of import bundles, and even declining pass-through. For example, improved inflation control led to declines in both the level and the velocity of inflation. The average inflation in China and Indonesia declined by almost 1/2 between 1993 and 2002. The elasticities of pass-through for the manufactured goods and products are generally lower. So the import bundles made the manufactured goods and food producers or the food products generally lower than the energy. So with the declining pass-through, it means that it implies a weakening link between the exchange rate stability and the inflation stability. So some challenges ahead for Asian economies. There's been many more uncertainties as China rises and becomes more assertive. the balance of power politics will be more pronounced as the years go on. There's going to be a time in the near future that trade war may escalate. Leadership is going to have to make a set of strategic choices about the position that they want the region to go towards, and it's extremely like how they interact with the rest of the region and the world. So that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and give it on to get the conclusion figured out. Thank you.
In this assignment, we looked at how monetary policy should respond to nominal exchange rate changes. We showed that the response to exchange rates depend on the degree of financial internationalization, the goods market integration, and the exchange rate pass-through. Sterilized intervention can be a strong tool that has an extra degree of freedom in increasing global welfare. Possible welfare benefits from sterilized intervention are biggest when the exchange rate pass-through is high and when the international goods markets are poorly integrated. However, there are limitations to the use of sterilized intervention. As financial internationalization increases, getting a certain degree of exchange rate stability requires increasing changes in foreign exchange reserves. Assuming that unstable reserves are likely to be costly, increased financial internationalization makes sterilized intervention somewhat unnecessary. And if there's a fully integrated international financial market, sterilized intervention has no help on exchange rates at all. If sterilized intervention becomes unnecessary, unsterilized intervention may be a better option. The only downside is that the possible welfare gains from the use of unsterilized intervention are fairly small. With unsterilized intervention, something like interest rates is being used to respond to another variable like exchange rates. This can mess up its response to inflation, but for other things like interest rates, unsterilized intervention can be used as a tool, and it doesn't mess with the response of interest rates to other variables. Most central banks in Asia use sterilized foreign exchange interventions as a tool to try and control exchange rate movements over time. Using sterilized intervention seems like a good idea from a welfare point of view, and it is when the goods markets and financial markets aren't integrated internationally very well, and the exchange rate pass-through is high. But this is starting to happen less and less in Asia. It seems like the degree of exchange rate pass-through has fallen now because of developing domestic financial markets and barriers to international capital flows decreasing. Financial internationalization has increased. Goods markets have also become more similar because consumer choices across countries are moving closer together. These changes are making the benefits of stabilizing exchange rates with sterilized foreign exchange intervention much smaller. And with unsterilized intervention not being very successful, it looks like the role of exchange rate movements in the optimal setting of monetary policy is falling across Asia. Are there any questions?